Empezamos una parte distinta, es primero la parte relacionada con el homenaje a Norman Bethune y después ya la parte que hemos dedicado más a las grandes ONGs, ¿no? Bueno, ya me conocéis ya nos hemos presentado, y lo que quería en definitiva ahora es, voy a hacer una corta presentación de la figura de Norman Bethune, de la cual durante media hora nos va a hablar Grant Stewart después, que lo conoce muchísimo mejor, y luego lo presentaré a él. Ya se ha comentado algo con anterioridad. ¿Quién es Norman Bethune para el que no conoce o no había oído hablar nunca de él? Pues Norman Bethune era un médico canadiense, una persona innovadora, en aquel momento definido como antifascista también y como quizá el canadiense más conocido de la historia reciente. Nació en Gravenhurst en 1890 y murió en China a los 49 años de edad. Al norte de Toronto, este es su lugar de nacimiento. En cuanto a su educación, estudió en el Owen Sound College and Vocational Institute y después en la Universidad de Toronto. Interrumpió sus estudios para ir a una colonia de leñadores de inmigrantes a enseñarles a leer y escribir. En 1914 fue a la Primera Guerra Mundial, pero no como médico, porque no lo era aún, sino como camillero. Estuvo herido de metralla en un hospital inglés y se graduó en 1916. En el 17 se enroló en la Royal Navy como teniente cirujano, ya una vez médico, y estuvo en el Chatham Hospital en Inglaterra. En el 19 empezó su internado especializándose, tenía interés en la pediatría en ese momento y estuvo en el Great Ormond Street Hospital, que es muy conocido en pediatría en el mundo, y después ya se hizo Fellow del Royal College of Surgeons en Edimburgo. Tras casarse en 1923 se estableció en Detroit, donde comenzó a hacer medicina privada y un trabajo también parcial como instructor en el Detroit College. Contrajo la tuberculosis en 1926, una enfermedad muy frecuente a principios del siglo XX, como conocéis, y fue a tratarse al Trudeau Sanatorio. En 1928 empezó a trabajar en cirugía torácica con uno de los pioneros, el doctor Edward Archibald, en Montreal, en el Royal Victoria. Es un hospital afiliado a la McGill. Y en 1933 creó un servicio de cirugía pulmonar en el primer servicio de cirugía torácica francófono en Canadá, el Hospital de Sacré-Cœur. Del 28 al 36 se hizo un cirujano torácico experto y modificó más de una docena de nuevos aparatos quirúrgicos. Quizá el instrumento más famoso es la cizalla costal, que aún se utiliza con distintas modalidades, y publicó unos 14 artículos, pues muestra de ellos son algunos de los que hay aquí. En cuanto a innovaciones, está la cizalla, por todos los cirujanos conocida, y es una persona que tuvo también una amplia actividad política, preocupado por los aspectos socioeconómicos de la enfermedad en el Montreal de los años 30, atendía gratis a los pobres y estimuló a los colegas también a reformas sanitarias por parte del gobierno, pero sin éxito. Propuso una medicina socializada y formó el Montreal Group of the Security of People's Health, y en el 35 viajó a la Unión Soviética para observar el sistema sanitario de primera mano, se hizo un comunista convencido y entró en el Partido Comunista de Canadá. Llegó a Madrid el 3 de noviembre de 1936 y en ese momento parecía no haber mayor necesidad de cirujanos en el bando republicano por el que él optó en aquel momento, y una de las cosas que en ese momento se le ocurrió fue hacer lo que se llamó el Servicio Canadiense de Transfusión de Sangre. En algún momento se ha comentado que fue el primer servicio de transfusión portátil. No es del todo cierto, puesto que unos meses antes el hematólogo Federico Durán y Jordà en Barcelona es el que primero empezó a hacer este tipo de acciones. Aquí vemos a Norman en algunas de sus actuaciones en esa época, fue nombrado comandante y coincidió aquí con personas como Müller, como Saxton. Müller fue después premio Nobel de Medicina, pero no por nada relacionado con las transfusiones, sino por el efecto de la irradiación y los efectos que producía en el organismo. Hay cierta polémica también sobre la utilización de sangre de cadáveres en aquella época, que parecía quizá la más accesible. Eso está todo un poco en revisión. Y en 1937 él vuelve a Canadá, donde realizó una gira de charlas para obtener fondos y voluntarios para la Guerra Civil Española. Poco después Viaja a China y desde donde viene el mayor reconocimiento, fundamentalmente por el servicio que hizo en el octavo ejército en la Segunda Guerra Sino-Japonesa. Introdujo en algún momento, de alguna manera, la medicina moderna en la China rural y trató con frecuencia tanto a civiles enfermos como a soldados heridos. En 1938 es cuando viaja a Yan'an, en la región de Shanbei, y allí se unió a los comunistas de Mao Zedong. El George Hatem, un médico libanés americano, es el que le había ayudado a pasar allí. Estas son algunas de las fotos de aquella época. Vemos que es un médico que había vivido también como quería en Montreal, tuvo muchísimo éxito allí, pero aquí vemos en qué condiciones vivía en aquella situación. Aquí trabajando en uno de esos hospitales que montaron, bueno, pues con los medios que había, aquí trabajando y también formando a la gente para poder mantener un mínimo nivel de actividad. Como pensaba Norman Bethune, pues aquí hay una síntesis un poco de algunos de sus pensamientos. La medicina tal y como la practicamos es una mercancía de lujo. Vendemos pan al precio de joyas, quitemos el beneficio económico privado fuera de la medicina y purifiquemos nuestra profesión de individualismo rapaz. No digamos a la gente cuánto tienes, sino cómo te puedo servir mejor. Norman Bethune murió el 12 de noviembre de 1936. Queríamos haber hecho la semana pasada esta conmemoración, pero a nosotros cirujanos nos coincidía con el Congreso Nacional y no nos pareció oportuno. Y la muerte fue pues, a través de haberse cortado un dedo mientras operaba a un enfermo infectado. Curiosamente, el responsable del desarrollo del servicio móvil de transfusión en el frente de la Guerra Civil Española moriría de envenenamiento de la sangre, de una septicemia. En cuanto a la siguiente presentación, quería introduciros a Grant Stewart. Grant, aparte de ser un cirujano con amplia experiencia, es compañero mío en las misiones que hemos llevado en los últimos 4 años en un hospital de Filipinas. Él nació en Perth, es australiano de origen, y se educó primariamente en Australia y después ya estuvo también en el Royal Marsden, en el Chester Beatty Institute of Cancer Research en Londres, y en 1960 se desplazó a la Universidad de Toronto. En 1965 se hizo doctor en medicina, se licenció por el Royal College of Physicians de Londres y es miembro del Royal College de Cirujanos de Edimburgo, de Inglaterra. Hizo un internado en el Toronto General Hospital y en el Hospital for Sick Children y después hizo sus estudios de posgraduación en el Galley Course en Cirugía General en la Universidad de Toronto. Es miembro del Real Colegio de Cirujanos de Canadá, ha sido profesor en el Toronto General and Women's College Hospital. Ha tenido mucho trabajo también en servicios de cirugía deportiva con el Toronto Argonaut Football Club, también con los conductores de Canadá. Ha tomado pues, parte también en temas de seguridad en el transporte, etc. Es también miembro fundador de la Sociedad de la Academia Canadiense de Deportes de Medicina Deportiva y muchas cosas más. En 1972 se desplazó a la Universidad de Calgary, en Alberta, como director de la docencia quirúrgica y fue también cirujano jefe. También ha sido consultor de las Fuerzas Armadas canadienses. Ha sido presidente también del Colegio Americano de Cirujanos en el capítulo de Alberta y presidente de la Asociación de Cirujanos Generales de Alberta. También ha sido cirujano de varios clubes de hockey, siempre le ha interesado la medicina deportiva y sus especiales áreas de interés en la cirugía han sido la cirugía esofágica, pancreática, el trauma agudo y la medicación continua. Ha hecho diversos cursos. Ha sido también chairman de la Asociación Canadiense de Cirugía y tras su retirada de la actividad habitual en Canadá se dedicó también durante varios años a la organización quirúrgica de varios hospitales en Arabia Saudí Y posteriormente, ya una vez retirado de la práctica clínica, se dedica también a misiones médicas en Tailandia, Filipinas y China. Él es director, fundador y presidente previo de la Bethune Canadian Alliance, que ahora se hablará también un poco, siguiendo un poco la estela de Bethune en China. Y bueno, pues esto es un poquito donde nos hemos conocido. Imaginaos qué carreteras en una isla de Filipinas, que es la que está en primera línea para los tifones del Pacífico. Este es el hospital provincial, por llamarlo de alguna manera, con unas instalaciones parecidas a las que hemos visto antes, aunque es cierto que un poquito han mejorado. El aspecto de las enfermeras, etcétera, desentona un poco del aspecto general de las habitaciones, etcétera. Hay cierto contrasentido en todo eso. Se ven muchísimas cirugías, litiasis renales, tumores muy avanzados, cornadas, no de toro bravo ibérico, sino de carabaos, que bueno, pues ayudamos a la gente a que los empiecen a tratar con mejoría, cuernos cutáneos, bocios muy importantes, varicoceles y enfermedades también urológicas, quemaduras también importantes, y esta es un poco la actividad. Por ejemplo, 78 cirugías generales el año pasado, junto con otras especialidades, y bueno, no todo es quirófano, también el fin de semana a veces dan unas horas para un poquito de relax y un poquito el futuro de lo que puede ser el país si lo podemos cuidar un poco mejor. Grant vive ahora en Vancouver, ya está retirado, y no quiero decir nada más, sino que él nos ilustre ahora sobre la presentación que nos ha traído de Bethune.
Thank you, Carmelo. That was absolutely embarrassing. I'm sorry you had to endure that introduction. But I am very grateful, Carmelo, for inviting me a first time to Spain and meeting with Dr. Fuentes and discussing McGill University. I was Toronto. I wanted to get a pair of scissors and cut his McGill tie off, but he wouldn't let me. But I thought the session leading up to this was excellent. The work that's being done overseas by your people is phenomenal, and I applaud you for that. And I think Norman Bethune would have been very pleased to have seen that this kind of work is going on throughout the world, because that's sort of what he was all about. And having said that, Carmelo has also given my speech in the introduction about Bethune. So can I sit down now, please? I'm going to talk about Norman Bethune, the man and his work, but he's a very interesting person. I went to University of Toronto, where Bethune went, although I was 50 years after him, and I'd never heard of Bethune. The names we heard were people like Frederick Banting, the discoverer of insulin, same class as Bethune, but we hadn't heard of Bethune. So I went to China, took one of my sons with me with the first Canadian hockey team ever to go to China, and all they ever asked me about was Bethune, and I wondered what that got to do with hockey. Obviously nothing. And so I said, well, yes, I know Bethune. Do you know him very well? Oh, Bethune's like family. I said, yes. So next time I went back to China, apparently I was a relative of Bethune because I was family. But I do bring you greetings from someone who is a relative, a very close friend of mine in Vancouver. We were both together touring in China, talking at the 75th commemoration of the death of Bethune. And he sends greetings to you in Spain too. He would like to come sometime and have a visit. He's not a doctor. He tells true stories. Anyway, the Norman Bethune is unknown in Canada and relatively still unknown. And yet in China, in less than 2 years, he became quite a hero for all of the things he did. Now, as I read more and learn more about Bethune, I don't think I would have liked the man very much. He was a difficult sort of person, and perhaps some of those things might come through in my talk. I hadn't learned much of what Bethune had done in Spain, and listening to Dr. Carmelo, yes, I'm learning quite quickly about what Bethune did in Spain. But I don't think he was recognized as well in Spain as he was in China, although that is now changing as well as it is in Canada. Well, his birthplace in Northern Ontario has all been restored, and it essentially is a place where all the Chinese tourists go at the moment, because we have a huge number of visitors from China, and we have a very large population of Chinese Canadians living in Vancouver, now called Hongcouver. Bethune had a father who was the pastor at the Knox Theological College in Toronto. He was called a sort of passive or bewildered, meek and rather reluctant father. The mother, however, and was 38 when she had Norman, was a devout English missionary, and she was very fanatic mission, and her convictions were very, very strong. She was a dominant religious woman. And I have put the odd Spanish translation here only because I learned in going to China, where I go so often, I Google Chinese translations and put them in there. Every now and again, there's no apparent reason, the audience starts to laugh. And so Google translation cannot be relied upon. I do the reverse Google translation from Chinese to Canadian English, and we're always laughing because it gets it wrong. So my apologies if we get it wrong. You correct it. Henry grew up in a family which lacked parental love, any love or warmth. And he himself said, I'm always alone. I'm always at fault. That's quite a statement from an 8-year-old. Mother, the so-called dragon, shrieking, demanding, and forcing her Sunday discipline, where the 3 children would sit all day long in their best clothes, learning excerpts of the Bible and having to recite it. At that stage, Norman was rebellious because he would take other little books in and hide them in the Bible that he had, and when Mother was not there, he would be reading those things. So there was a love-hate relationship starting at a very early age, and this is important when you look at Bethune's life leading into his death in China, which was even quite interesting. Father Malcolm was weak and fanatical, and so this kid didn't get kindness, didn't get love, and felt somewhat rejected. On the other hand, the grandfather, Norman Bethune, who was a physician, recognized the little Bethune's interest in medicine, in life in the wilderness, and he gave him some guidance and some hope and some pride and a little bit of love. He gave him some books, and he gave him some sort of teaching. But to make all of this worse, the family never seemed to stay in the same place very often. They were moving in religious mode from one parish or one church to another. So no close friendships were ever developed. So if we look at the young developing Bethune, we see he had a rejection of love or intimate affection. And this followed through with his later relationships. He's often been described as a womanizer. Well, only to so far. The womanizing to the bedroom apparently wasn't quite significant. He lacked confidence. He saw the fanaticism at home, and almost lies and deceit were cast upon him. He hated his mother. She was the dragon. He did not respect his father, but he did love and respect the grandfather. And just to show how serious that was in his mind, he said, I am not Henry Bethune. I am Norman Bethune. So by taking the name Norman, it is the name not given by his mother. It is a direct act sort of against the mother. And this is a sort of life that Bethune started in and carried on many, many years in his questionable behavior. So he had sort of abandoned his parents, and that's a lot for a 5-year-old to suddenly say in his own mind, I've abandoned my parents. Well, he went to Owen Sound Collegiate in Northern Ontario, the home of one of the greatest hockey players ever, Bobby Orr, and graduated there at the age of 17 years. He got a glimpse of what it was like to be away from home by going to the lumber camps, the wilderness, and he could spread his wings a little bit and suddenly feel more outgoing. It was the end of his childhood. And then he went to University College for a short while looking at science and biology. And in 1911 went to Frontier College where he taught English, but more than that, he mixed in with the laborers. He became a boxer. He became a hunter. He got involved with the fur traders. And in 1914, he signed up as a stretcher bearer with the Canadian Field Ambulance and got interested in war and fighting. He eventually, after all of this, graduated from the University of Toronto in 1916 and joined the Royal Navy, went to Ormond Street Hospital and did his surgery in London, graduating in Edinburgh in 1922 as a surgeon. Well, there are four aspects of Bethune's life which are sort of mixed up, messed up. His personal life, certainly. Medical life, probably. He was not really liked very much by the establishment. His social life was very messed up. Probably his best life was his political life. But let's come back to these. In personal life, when he was in England, he married Frances Penny, who was wealthy, nice, polite, neat, and all of these things which Bethune didn't really seem to understand. And then he got tuberculosis in 1926. He said, I've got tuberculosis, I'm divorcing you. I'm not going to live, go home. And she didn't. She stayed in Canada, and he treated his own tuberculosis by collapsing his lung after having been in the sanatorium in outside New York. So he remarried Frances. He pleadingly remarried her. And that was all fine, we think, except there was a third member involved, one of Bethune's friends who had kept an eye on Frances when Norman wasn't around. So that marriage didn't work because there were three of them in the marriage. So Norman finally divorced again in 1933. Does this tell you something about Norman's behavior? Well, in medical life, in 1924 in Detroit at the Harbour Hospital, he had a few elite people and he had a very mixed bag of other kinds of patients. So I'll come to that. In 1928, he went through the McGill program, with all due reference, sir, to the McGill University. Dr. Archibald was the pioneer surgeon there and tolerated Bethune for a while, but eventually out of here, and Bethune went to Sacré-Cœur, where he was involved in the early stages of conscious sedation, and he was certainly involved in blood transfusion. He developed various apparatus, but his social life, when he was in London and meeting up with Frances, he was a little bit loose in Soho. When I left Australia and went to England, this is an aside, by the way, when I left Australia and went to England, I used to go down in Soho as well. And I was only 20, I can see why Bethune had a good time. But he met up with radicals, writers, artists, musicians, and drinkers. In Detroit, when he came back to North America, I write here that he's got gangsters and prostitutes. It wasn't quite that bad. His clientele in daytime for surgery were people who paid and had proper money and were real people. But at nighttime, the underworld had no one to go to for their stab wounds, gunshots, and these things, so they came to Bethune, and he made money. And so the ladies of the night, the honorable profession, needed care outside the medical system. They came to Bethune. Interesting. He'd never really had friendships, and he didn't have very good, strong, or personal relationships that lasted. In his political life, he was interested in health care for the poor. He had children's creative arts centers, and on weekends he had lots of children in his apartments drawing and doing social things, and he had free health clinics. So the Montreal years, as we called them, was take private profit out of medicine. He resented the Mount Royal, lovely group of people who helping the poor people who needed it the most. So this was the first sign we really saw of true humanitarian approach by Bethune. Well, his political unrest got him involved in, interested in communism. He spoke about social injustices. He talked about the healthcare injustices. And his humanitarian streak had him discussing capitalism, democracy, and communism came into the picture. He went to Russia, learnt more about it, learnt how the treatment of tuberculosis was ever so much more successful in Russia than it was in Canada, came back and tried to get Montreal to follow the same guidelines for the poor people. He joined the Communist Party, and that was probably because he was anti-fascist rather than true communist at the time. But he looked at this in his own mind. This is an escape to Spain because I can do something in Spain. I cannot do it here in Montreal. So to Spain he went, and we know Bethune for his battlefront blood transfusion service. He met up with the Canadian Committee to Aid Spanish Democracy in Madrid, and his whole approach to the business of war now was suddenly real. He was here, and there were fighting going on, and that's what he liked. And he already found out that there were Canadians in Spain, the Mackenzie Papillot Battalion, and he met up with the international brigades. But Bethune was an interesting mixture of peoples within one. He had so much enthusiasm, he was impatient. He wanted action. He was restless. He had this revolutionary plan to take blood transfusion services to many battlefronts to treat injured soldiers. So he set about and purchased a van and refrigeration equipment and raised the money to support the cause. He saw the blood services into Valencia. He went to Paris and London for more vans and enjoyed the nightlife of London. He saw the excitement and the thrill of danger in Madrid because war was in progress. But he also saw the homeless, the hungry, and the wounded families. He saw orphaned children, so he wanted to create villages for these children who were homeless. Another humanitarian streak showing up. But he had his office at the Palace Hotel Hospital, which was the club of the time. So he continued his social lifestyle where alcohol was one vehicle of payment. The blood transfusion service opened up just before Christmas, and he set about with his mobile vehicles performing blood transfusions. Carmela referred to the transfusion research, the interesting phenomenon of cadaver research. Hardly researched by what we know it as today, but it was practical and at least partly effective. So we knew Bethune for his work on the battlefront with blood transfusion services. And he saw through the civil war here, along this rugged coastal strip, which I would love to go visit one day, the Malaga and Almeria, the crime that was going on, the battles that were there, the need for blood transfusions, the transportation of the civilians from danger, and even transportation of the enemy. But Bethune was Bethune. He was intolerant of officials. Why am I not in charge was his question of the blood transfusion service. He was at conflict. He was drinking. He didn't eat very much. He had a frequent temper, and he was outspoken. And I think, as he has said, in May 1937, he was sent home. I have blotted my copybook. So back to Canada he goes. And you've had interest in establishing streets and areas in his name, and more recently you've had many developments in the interest of Norman Bethune. Well, this was his humanitarian effort, was the blood transfusion service on battlefields. In Canada, he decided, I'm going to prepare for a medical unit to go to China to support the fight there, the war of aggression. He approached the Chinese Aid Council. He raised funds and medical supplies. And he met up with the Dr. Charles Parsons, who was another heavy drinker. and Nurse Jean Ewan, who was a very polite, nice little lady, a bit like his first wife, his only wife, but she spoke some Chinese, and off they went to China. And these are the kind of mountains that Bethune went to and worked in northern China. And we know him for his battlefield trauma management. He arrived in Hankou and traveled from Wuhan along that railway line going north, which he describes as a journey from hell. He was bombed on the train. They had to sleep on the hills on the roadside, and it took a long while to get to Yan'an. He met up at the 8th Route Army headquarters with the eventual President Mao Zedong, and he established medical clinics in these caves. And I've been into these caves, and I thought they would be cold and miserable. They're not. They're actually quite warm for whatever reason, the heat within the soils. And he was there for some months seeing people that came back from the war. And at that time, from the battlefields, very few deaths actually made it to a base hospital. The deaths that did occur were from head, chest, and abdomen, and only the fractures and soft tissue wounds were transported. The battle injuries were artillery and mortar bomb injuries, and the potentially mortally wounded were given pain medication and left there. They may have been given some antibiotics that was available. Those that could be transported that might live were then brought on mule or horseback. Well, what did Bethune learn about trauma in China in 1938? He'd only been there 3 months. Well, he discovered that all the battles were in the mountain areas. There were many, many injured soldiers and civilians, but there were very few doctors, nurses, or medics. The wounded were transported untreated. The wounds were infected, and in some cases a tourniquet round the leg had been on for some weeks before the person ever got to medical care, so there were many gangrenous limbs. The soldiers were young and inexperienced. They had poor outcome from treating anything. They didn't know enough, and the morale was very, very low. At the 8th Route Army, Bethune was appointed medical advisor, and he met all the key players, Nai Rongjun, commander, Zhou Enlai, eventual president, and he said, "I must go where I am most needed." And Bethune, contrary to being told, "No, you can't go," was Bethune, and he went. And he went to the battlefronts in the Wutai Mountains. And if you have a chance to go to China, this is one great place to go and visit for its scenic beauty. 5 different peaks scattered around here, and you can go up and down from one to the other. It takes a bit of time, and you need to be young. But it's a wonderful area, but it's brutal if you want to try and practice medicine, particularly trauma medicine. What did he do? Well, he built himself a little model hospital against the advice of Nai Rongjun, because the enemy were approaching, and in 3 weeks this hospital was bombed and they had to get out of there. Fortunately, they got out of there first before it was bombed. It's been rebuilt, and this is an example of the little rooms and the equipment and the beds. He designed equipment, and particularly for carrying pharmacy supplies on horseback. And he wrote articles and drawings of these types of equipment. He carried out blood transfusions from himself to patients and from other soldiers to soldiers. But he loved teaching, it seems, because he opened up many little teaching clinics. And I've visited all of these that I'm showing, and just recently have come back from China, and we visited 2 more where he actually spent time. And believe me, they're quite primitive little places. I'll show you a couple of pictures. But he wrote a book. Imagine that in wartime, treating all these injuries, and you've got time to somehow write a book, which he did, on the organization and technique of military field hospitals in guerrilla war. And it was actually a very important manual, because guerrilla war is something where you just get in quick and get out quick, and no one knows where it's going to happen next. And that's the way to throw the organized armies that were coming down, throw them off and upset them. He built a medical school. This was the first one, opened in September 1939, and It's way up in the hills, very strategic position, so that the enemy couldn't get to it if they wanted to without coming up these long hills and long little roadways. And his battles, though, they were long. There were terrible conditions and there were very few supplies and there were loss of too many young lives. And Bethune lost his own life, 12th of November, 1939. And he didn't actually die now. He took 3 weeks to sort of die from infection and sepsis, and he still tried to carry on working. He actually died in this little place, Wangshuku. And when they moved him from there, typical Bethune, he was restless that he was dead. They had to move him 3 or 4 times before they found somewhere to finally put him because of the enemy. He went to a little place in Wolf Mountain Gate, which had not been discovered for a long while, and a group of us went in and found the headstone. There we are on the far middle picture. It's under bushes and under some little mountains. He was moved again to Juncheng, but the Japanese came, so they lifted him out of the ground, carried him away into the mountains, and buried him temporarily, and the enemy were using target practice at the headstone there. He was taken to another little village after that, and this time he'd been dug up 2 or 3 times and was cleaned up, and then eventually, after Chairman Mao had decided that Bethune deserved a better memorial, was taken into Szechwan, the capital of Hebei province, and there is a huge cemetery of martyrs there now. Well, Bethune's contribution was that of contribution to trauma care and military medicine. He probably was the second notable author about trauma care in the American literature, at least. He wrote on the principles of trauma care, rapid triage and treatment, on fluid and blood transfusion, and set up basic field hospitals. And these are some of the most recently visited operating rooms. The one on the far side was the operating room. He was there for 3 months, and there's a little hospital just next to it, another little hospital here, and this was one small room where all the villages had the hospital patients in beds, and they would bring them up these little narrow roadways, and he would operate there. His other contributions included medical organization, improved transportation, medical education, particularly about clean wounds, clean water, and infection control. The same things we're interested in today. He found the wounds were untreated and infected, shortage of medical supplies, and slow transportation. So he set about correcting all of those things, and he did. There are over 260 institutions in China named in honor of Bethune. And the one on the right there, there's the International Peace Hospital, is really a leader in world stem cell surgery. I go there once a year and do some work with them on some of the poor people that we bring in from the provinces. And I guess my main role there is to see that they get the work done and they're not charged for it. Hospitals have a way of trying to extract money from people that don't have it. But anyway, Bethune provided legacy in trauma management, and he was an example in humanitarianism. He inspired the soldiers, and this might be his greatest contribution. He gave them hope and courage. Attack. If we are wounded, we have Baiqiuen to treat us, was their motto. And Sir Isaac Newton had said, we see so far because we stand on the shoulders of giants. I suspect in China, Baiqiuen would be considered such a giant. Though Bethune we know of for his blood and his battles, internationally and at home. We have an organization, can I take a few minutes on this? Extending the work of Norman Bethune, and people say, well, why would you be working in China where it's such a rich country? Well, there's a tremendous difference between the rich and the poor. We also have such a large Chinese-Canadian population who want to give back to their home roots. So we have an organization which is called the Bethune Baiqiuen Canadian Alliance. And we promote friendship between the people of Canada and other countries, advancing the Norman Bethune legacy in healthcare and education. We exchange knowledge and experience with healthcare providers, consultation, medical aid, and education to local communities in need. We visit schools and healthcare centers and donate medical needed supplies. We advance the humanitarian causes and aid underprivileged areas. Some of our general projects in the rural villages. There's an example of how patients come to see you. That's their mode of transportation. Interestingly enough, the fellow in the background in the white shirt is also a relative of Bethune, and he had that same get on and do something mentality that he wanted to go straight to Beijing and tell them to fix up the toilets, they stink, whatever. And so that wasn't quite the right way to approach a rural area and Beijing. But he had the Bethune genes, all right. Other little places we spend time going in the far top corner there. I went and visited this family. They had both been treated or seen by Bethune. One was 104 years old and her husband was 102. And we found many little villages where people had known and been treated by Bethune. We go into many little areas, dental health, preventive health, and acute trauma management. Our funds come from fundraising banquets. We try and get the political people involved and have special events. And we do develop these projects within the villages. We're very big into getting into the schools where they all know about Bethune, and we provide a lot of school educational material, sports equipment, and do healthcare clinics. We have some pediatric help. And these are some of the schools, the school children. We have one cardiovascular project recognizing that there's a high risk factor in the people in the village of Nuango. And so we've been doing studies there now through John Dukas, who's president of our organization, and his daughter Robin. And we've come up with some very interesting findings. And better still, we've now got the Bethune Peace Hospital coming with us, one-on-one. We've got a group of 30. They'll send 30 doctors and nurses with us and travel to these places so that the rural areas are learning that they can trust their own hospitals and their own doctors, something which isn't particularly strong at the moment. But that's a great step forward to have the local hospitals being receptive to the big institution hospitals. There were some results. One particular project which we've taken a lot of time over is the neural tube defects. Ever since some years ago we identified this one boy who had the spina bifida that had been, or meningomyelocele, been corrected at birth, but he had nothing else done for him. He had many congenital abnormalities. Well, we've undertaken this project with him, and last operation was just this past October, doing both ankles and stabilizing them. And he's up walking around, and we've got all of this done for free in China, although we bring a lot of funds to support the school where he goes to and all the community where he is living. We have several examples of these children, but the big thing, of course, is folic acid and the prevention of neural tube defects. Another area we're working on is the motor vehicle accident. It's not about treating the accident, it's about the principles of prevention of it. And in China, there are more than 250,000 people killed each year. And the many reasons are speed, alcohol, fatigue, snow and fog, and the other is just plain stupid driving. If there's a space somewhere in the road, they drive for it. And it's a very tough way to get people interested in driving sensibly and safely. But with lecture programs in the smaller centers, it's getting through. So we emphasize prevention injury. So, Bethune, blood and battles. And we continue some of those things on a very small scale in the rural areas. And I think we can say that this particular 75th anniversary of Bethune, we've had a fairly large presence in China. And we had very large commemorative celebrations with a lot of publicity, and hopefully some of our projects will be continued forward in the rural areas, just like the many projects that I heard earlier on today will be continued forward in those remote areas of Africa and South America. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Grant.